everybody, Mike here with Delta Faucet. If you're planning a bathroom renovation or even doing new construction, a steam shower can make all the difference in elevating your showering experience, and it's a project that we can help you tackle. Now in this video, we'll be running through the installation steps for the Delta SteamScape Deluxe System. Keep in mind that building codes are different everywhere, and for the scale and components of this project, you will need a licensed electrician and a licensed plumber. Also, you want to make sure that you have a 208 or 240 volt circuit available, as well as a nearby water supply stop. Now before we get started, we want to make sure you're watching the right video. Take a look at your installation booklet or packaging to confirm what steam system you selected. This video will cover the Delta SteamScape Deluxe System. However, if you have a different Delta Steam product, be sure to check out the separate video we have for that. Also, we want to make sure that you've purchased all of the required components. This includes the control and steam head package, as well as the SteamScape generator. Now in this video, I will also install the optional generator pan and auto drain. It's important to note that while these are not required components, they are definitely recommended for some peace of mind. You might also be pairing the Delta audio system. Be sure to check out the separate video we have for that. Okay, a few additional notes. First, the shower area or steam room needs to be completely enclosed to retain the steam. Your walls and your ceiling need to be tiled, insulated, and waterproofed. Your shower door also needs to have a continuous seal with your enclosure. However, a small gap at the bottom of the door of say a ½ inch or less is definitely recommended for a little bit of additional airflow. All right, with all that said, let's dive in. So the first steps in our installation happen during the rough framing phase, which you can see that we're in here. What we want to do is think through how you're going to utilize your steam shower once everything's completed. In my enclosure, you'll notice that I have my main showering components on the side wall here, and I'm going to be installing a seat on the opposite wall, which is where I'll probably be sitting when I operate the steam shower. So the first thing we think about is where we want to locate our steam head. Now, generally speaking, I want the steam head as far away from me when I'm in that seated position because steam is hot, so I'm going to locate it on that far wall. Also, I want to make sure that that steam head isn't going to be located directly below any of my other showering components because steam rises and could cause those components to become hot to the touch. Finally, I also make sure that steam head is about 12 to 18 inches off of my finished floor, and also think through any of these steam head trims you're going to be selecting, making sure that when we get to that installation part, it's not going to be too close to the corner or anything else that could cause an issue when you install that trim. All right, once we have that steam head located, we can move on to locating our control panel. Now there's a few things to remember here. First and foremost, we want to make sure that the control panel is inside of our enclosure. Secondly, we also want to make sure that the control panel is far enough away from our steam head and our other showering components to ensure an accurate temperature reading. And finally, again, thinking through how you're going to utilize the steam shower, want to make sure that it's in a spot that's going to be accessible to you when you're actually using the steam shower. So again, for my instance here, I'm going to be on the side wall, sitting down, so I want to make sure it's within arm's reach. Now I'm going to install it on my back wall just above this horizontal shelf I have here. Now generally, we like to see the steam control mounted about 48 inches off of the finished floor. However, use your best judgment for your application at home. I like to double check the location of my control panel and also my steam head one last time to make sure it's not going to interfere with any of the finished decisions I'm making for my enclosure, such as tile or something similar. Once you're happy with these locations, we can move on to selecting the location of our generator. Next, we can move on to determining where we want to install our steam generator. So I have my generator here dry fit in place just so I can kind of show you how this is all going to work. And it's inside of a closet, and the closet wall backs up to my shower enclosure. Now the location of the steam generator can be inside of a closet, or it can be in an insulated attic or basement, or even inside of a vanity, but there are a few things that we want to remember. First and foremost is that it needs to be accessible. And I think it's a great idea to check your installation booklet to make sure that we're maintaining all of the minimum clearances around the unit for the one that you chose. Secondly, we want to make sure that the steam pipe that's going to connect the steam head inside of our enclosure to the generator itself is going to be 50 feet or less. Also, the control cable that connects the control panel inside the enclosure to our steam generator needs to be 70 feet or less. Now keep in mind that the cord that ships with the unit is 35 feet long. However, for your application, if you need a little bit of additional length, Delta does offer extension cords in 10, 35, and 50 foot lengths. So once we're happy with the location we've chosen for our steam generator, we can go ahead and have our licensed electrician and our licensed plumber come in to finish up the roughing requirements for this installation. First, for the electrical, you'll notice they ran a dedicated wire that goes back from my breaker box to my steam generator location according to the specifications outlined within the instruction booklet. I also had my electrician add some conduit for a location just above my generator, all the way back inside my enclosure to the spot I chose for my control panel. That'll allow me to connect the generator to the control panel with a control cord at a later step. Now for this installation, I'll also be installing the optional audio package. So I've had my electrician add an additional outlet here, as well as I've also pre-run my speaker wire from here back inside my enclosure to my future speaker locations. Now, if you need some additional help adding this optional audio package, be sure to check out the separate video we have for that. Now for the plumbing, you'll notice my plumber has given us a cold water stub out here just above the generator, which will supply the unit with water. Also, we've connected our steam line, and the steam line was a few things I want to point out here. The first is that the steam line is a 3/4 inch copper line. And we also want to make sure that the line has a little bit of a pitch to it, either back towards the generator, which is preferred, or towards the shower itself. Now the reason for this is we want to make sure that there's no condensation that might be sitting in the line. Also, if the line is greater than 10 feet, we recommend insulating the line with a heat appropriate insulation. Now, a little bit of a pro tip here is no matter how long that line is, I definitely recommend going ahead and insulating it because it will ensure that your unit is operating at maximum efficiency. Finally, you'll also notice that I have a drain at this location because I'm going to be installing the optional generator drain pan and auto drain. However, even if you're not installing these two optional units, I definitely recommend still adding a drain to this location because it will make maintenance that much easier, and it also may be required by code. So, with all that said, let's go ahead and have our electrician and plumber finish out the rough-ins, and we'll move on to some final installation steps. Now that we have our walls and floors finished, we can move on to installing our steam generator. Now, before we do that, you'll notice that my electrician has provided us with a disconnect at my installation location, as well as a conduit and wire that's going to serve our final electrical connection to our generator. Also, they helped me run my control cable, which again goes to the control panel inside of my shower and is going to connect into the back of my generator. And also the speaker wire and outlets going to be required for the optional audio package that I'll be installing later. My plumber has gone ahead and given me a shut off on my water supply line and finished off the drain in my floor. So once everything looks good, we're going to dry fit our unit in the installation location. Now, if you remember, I'm going to be installing the optional generator drain pan. So I'm going to place that down first, followed by the steam generator itself. Now that we have that generator in place, there's a few things I want to double check. First, I want to make sure that the generator is sitting roughly in the middle of my drain pan. I also want to make sure that it's meeting any of the required clearances around the unit as outlined within my installation booklet. And I also want to make sure that the generator is installed perfectly level. I also think it's a good idea to just start thinking through my drain pan drain as well as the drains of the unit itself, making sure I have easy access to that floor drain or however I'm going to drain that water. Next, I'm going to double check my mechanicals. First, making sure that my electrical connection has plenty of slack to make the connection to the unit, which it does. I'm going to double check my control cable, making sure I have plenty of slack to connect to the back of the steam generator, which it looks like I do. And also I want to think through my plumbing connections, making sure my supply line can easily reach the supply line on the steam generator, which it can. Next, I want to check my steam pipe, making sure that the steam pipe coming out of the wall is roughly in line with the output pipe on the steam generator itself. Now, when my plumber finishes this connection, it'll include a union between the wall pipes and the pipe running into the generator. This will make it easy to remove the unit for maintenance or replacement if you ever need to do so. Now, also for my installation, I'll be installing the optional auto drain. There's a few things I want to talk through on this auto drain before we have it installed. First, I want to point out on the bottom of the auto drain, you'll see a little black arrow with the word flow below it. We want to make sure that arrow is pointed away from my steam generator. This is going to be installed down at the bottom output on my steam generator like so. And I want to think through the additional plumbing that's going to be required to direct that water into my floor drain. We want to make sure that drain has a little bit of a negative pitch away from the unit because this functions by gravity. So we want to make sure all the water is running away and not back to the unit itself. And if you look on the back of the auto drain, you'll see that there is this little lever that needs to be in the open position for the duration of the install. Once our plumber's made all of the final connections, we can come back and make sure that this lever has been moved to the closed position. Okay, once everything looks good, we can have our electrician or plumber come back in to make all of our final connections, and they'll be ready to move on to the next step.
All right, now that my electrician and plumber have made all of their final connections, let's check out the unit to see how everything's coming together. Now, first and foremost, before my electrician made any connections, we verified that the main power supply that's going to be supplying the unit was in the off position. Next, you may also notice that I've installed the optional audio speaker package that can be added to the unit itself. If you're doing this, be sure to check out the separate video that we have that will walk you through those installation steps. So the first thing we added was this optional auto drain to the bottom of my unit. For the electrical connection, I ran the wires through this included conduit, through the bottom knocket out of the unit, and then connected the wires to the appropriate lugs on the circuit board here. And now that we have the auto drain fully installed, I can move that lever on the back of the auto drain to the closed position.
Next, we took that control cable that, if you remember, runs to the control panel inside of the shower, ran it through one of the back knockouts on the steam generator, using a stress relief clip to protect the cord, and then plugging it into one of the available ports on the control panel. Now, it doesn't matter what port you choose, the functionality will be exactly the same no matter what. After that, we also connected our main power line, coming through this top conduit, and then connecting the ground and the 2 power wires to the respective lugs inside of the steam generator. Next, my plumber also connected our main steam line here, again using that union that we discussed in case we ever need to remove the unit for whatever reason.
And also, my plumber's given me a little bit of extra tubing here off the end of my pressure relief valve, making sure it drains directly into my drain pan or into my floor drain. Now, the important thing to remember with this connection is that there needs to be an air gap between the bottom of the drain pipe and the top of whatever it's draining into of at least double the diameter of the pipe. So in this instance, this is a 3/4 inch copper pipe, meaning that gap needs to be a minimum of 1.5 inches. Also, my plumber added a little elbow to the tail end of my optional auto drain here, making sure that any water that flows through the auto drain is directed into my floor drain. And again, this needs to have an air gap. However, this time, this pipe is only 1/2 inch in diameter, so that air gap needs to be at least 1 inch. And finally, I also had my plumber add a little elbow off the end of my drain pan here, directing any water that comes in the drain pan into my floor drain. However, the important thing to remember here is that no air gap is required.
Okay, everything's looking great here, so I can go ahead and put the cover panel back on my steam generator, and then we'll move inside the shower to install our steam head and our control panel. So here we are inside of our shower enclosure. Now with the Deluxe system, you do have a few different options of trim style you can install for your steam head inside of the shower. Now for this video, I'll be showing you how to install both a square steam head and also a unilateral steam head, since the installation steps do differ slightly. So to get started, let's walk through how to install the square head first. Now the first step of this installation is going to be dry fitting our steam head onto our steam pipe. But before we do that, I want to talk through the steam pipe for just a second. First and foremost, we need to confirm that our pipe and our threaded end here is made out of brass or copper. Second, I want to confirm that my tile installer has kept the hole for the steam pipe as tight to the pipe as possible, making sure that there's no gaps between the pipe and the tile itself of greater than, say, 1/2 inch. And then finally, I need to make sure that the threaded end of the pipe is protruding from the finished surface of my enclosure here by somewhere between 1/4 to 1/2 inch. Once everything looks good, we can move on to the steam head. Now the steam head itself, you'll see, comes in 2 pieces. It's got the threaded end of the steam head that holds onto the pipe, and then also a back plate the steam head fits into. So to dry fit this, I'm gonna start by adding a bead of sealant or pipe tape to the threads of the pipe to make sure we're mimicking the exact conditions we're gonna see when we install the steam head for the final time. So I'm gonna be using my pipe tape here, wrapping it along the threads of my steam pipe in a clockwise direction, since that's the way the steam head tightens onto the pipe. And also making sure that none of the tape is covering the outlet of the pipe. Just like that. Once that looks good, I'm gonna go ahead and take my back plate, hold it in place over my pipe, followed by my steam head, fitting it through the center, and then gently threading it onto the end of the pipe. One thing you'll notice here is I'm not using any tools to thread this onto the pipe. I don't want to use a wrench or pliers or anything similar, because that could cause damage to the finish of the steam head and my back plate. And all we need to do here is just hand tighten everything down. All right, so I've got that nice and snug. And now there's a few things I want to check for. First, I want to confirm the orientation of the steam head. I'm going to make sure that my essential oil reserve is facing straight up. Next, I want to make sure that my back plate is sitting tight against the finished surface of my enclosure. And finally, I also want to think through how the steam is going to enter my enclosure. Now, the default setup for the steam head is basically emitting steam in all 4 directions: top, bottom, left, and right. However, if for your installation you decided you wanted to be a little bit more directional with the steam for whatever reason, there is a diverter plate that can be installed to the back of the steam head that I'll show you how to do in just a second here. And also, when you're hand tightening this down snug, if you notice that you weren't able to achieve a snug fit and also have the essential oil reserve facing straight up, there is a way to adjust the threads on the back of the steam head that I'll show you in just a second. Once everything looks good, we can go ahead and take the steam head back off the wall. Okay, now as I mentioned before, there's a way to adjust the threads on the back of the steam head. You'll notice that there's two pieces here. There's this main hub that is held to the steam head itself with 3 screws on the inside. Now, if you need to adjust the threading, you can remove those 3 screws, rotate the hub 120 degrees either to the left or to the right, reattach the screws, and then that might help you get a better orientation when hand tightening the steam head to your steam pipe. Also, I mentioned about diverting the steam. Your steam head will ship with one diverter plate here. The way this works is whatever way you want to close the steam off from being delivered into your enclosure, attach it to the back of your steam head and hold it in place with the 2 screws, 1 in each corner, and that'll keep the steam from coming out in that direction. Now, if you really want to have full control over how the steam comes out, you decide you want to add 1 or even 2 more diverter plates to the head, you certainly can do that. So just be sure to contact Delta's customer service team. They'll be more than happy to help. All right, we're moving on to final install. So I went ahead and added some pipe sealant or tape to my threads here, and we're ready to install our steam head for the final time. So what I'm going to do this time is again take my back plate, taking the surface that's going to come in contact with my shower enclosure, and I'm going to apply a bead of silicone sealant around the rim of this back plate to ensure a nice tight seal. Now, the silicone sealant I'm going to be using is the same tube that comes included in your kit for your control panel. So I'm going to take my silicone here and apply a continuous bead all the way around in a circle on my back plate, like so. With that in place, I'm going to take the back plate, push it tight against my enclosure wall in the correct orientation, making sure in this case I'm perfectly square, and then gently start threading it onto my steam pipe. All right, gotta hand tighten that up again, and here's where I want to make some final checks. First off, I want to make sure I have final alignment, making sure that my essential oil reserve is facing straight up. Also making sure that my back plate is perfectly square and that it's sitting tight around the enclosure wall. And that about wraps up this installation. The last step would be to make sure I've cleaned up any of the silicone sealant that may have squeezed out when I was securing everything in place. And also make sure I give this ample time to fully cure before I was to put it into use. And that's another thing I want to make a note of. When you're using your steam head, it will become quite hot. So if you're worried about the potential for any inadvertent contact with the steam head itself, there is a silicone cover that you could apply to the steam head for just a little bit of added protection. All right, that wraps up the installation for the square steam head. Now let me walk you through the unilateral steam head. Now, one of the key differences in the installation steps between the unilateral trim as opposed to the square trim is that the unilateral trim doesn't require any dry fitting steps, so we can jump right in. I've gone ahead and cleaned my threads off and applied some fresh plumber's tape, and now I'm going to take my base nut and be applying a bead of silicone to the bottom of it along the outer ring that's going to come in contact with my shower enclosure wall. I also think it's a great idea at this point to flip it over and make sure that the O-ring is in the correct position on the other side of the nut. Once everything looks great, I'm going to take that sealant. Again, this is the silicone that comes with the installation pack for my control panel. I'm going to apply it to the outer ring of this base nut. Continuous bead all the way around. Just like that. Once that's complete, I'm going to place the nut again, making sure I have the right edge facing my enclosure wall, and thread it onto my pipe. Now, just like for the square trim, I'm not using any tools here. Everything can be done by hand to ensure I'm not going to damage any of the finishes. All right, perfect. Now with that in place, I can move on to installing my unilateral trim head. So on the back of the trim head, again, I'm going to be adding a bead of silicone sealant along the outside edge all the way around the head. Taking my silicone. Okay, once I've got that ready to go, I'm going to carefully line it over my base nut and press it fully into place until it comes in contact with my enclosure wall. Once it looks like it's lined up well, a little bit of pressure, and it will sit tight against the wall. Now again, just like before, this is the time I want to check some final alignment. I want to make sure my trim head is sitting nice and level in relation to my enclosure, and also that my essential oil reserve is facing up. If everything looks good, I can lock the head into place on the base nut using an 1/8" hex key. That lock screw is right on the bottom of the trim head here. I'm going to hold it in place with one hand and tighten it with the other. Okay, I've got that trim head all locked into place. And that about wraps up the installation. At this point, I want to make sure I'm going to use a rag to clean off any of this excess silicone that most likely squeezed out while I was pressing that trim head onto my tile, and then also allow ample time for everything to dry before I put that steam head into use. Also, one final note is that when the steam head is in use, it will become quite hot. So if you're worried about the potential for any inadvertent contact with it, you can use the silicone cover that came with your product to slip it over the trim head itself, and that'll offer an additional layer of protection. Okay, with the trim head installed, now I can move on to installing our control panel. Here we are at the location we'll be installing our control panel. This is the same one we determined during the rough framing phase. Now the first thing you'll notice is that I've drilled a 3-inch hole through my tile and also around the other end of my control cable, the same one that connects back to the steam generator. So the first step is going to be taking my coupler here and connecting one end, it doesn't matter which side, to the control cable. What I'm listening here for is a snap to ensure a good connection. After that's complete, I'm going to take the cable coming out the back of my control panel and snap it into the other side of the coupler, again listening for that snap. Okay, now that I've ensured a good connection, we can move on to the next step. But before we do that, I think it's a great idea to take a minute to go ahead and test the system to make sure it looks like everything's functioning correctly. So to do this, I'm going to go ahead and take a moment to turn on the power to my steam generator as well as the water supply, give it a minute or two for everything to boot up correctly, and then come back here, check my control panel to make sure it looks like everything's working well. Okay, I've given it a minute or two for my steam system to fully boot up, so now I can check my control panel to make sure it looks like everything's functioning correctly, which it does. So now I can move on to installing my control panel on the wall itself. Now keep in mind there's two ways I can do this. I can either install it in the landscape orientation, like I will be here, or I can even rotate it to install in the portrait format. However, keep in mind that it is possible to install the unit upside down, so just keep an eye on the screen to verify that you're installing it in the right orientation. Once you're comfortable, we can flip it over, and we're going to remove the adhesive on the back of the control panel here. Set that off to the side. And next, I'm going to be adding a bead of silicone sealant that came included with the control panel all the way around the edge of the unit on all 4 sides, trying to keep it in that little gap between the adhesive and the edge of the control panel. So I'm going to grab the adhesive here. Just do a thin bead on all 4 sides. Now what the sealant is going to do is help to ensure a watertight seal between the outside of my control panel and my enclosure wall. Okay, once that looks good, I'm gonna go ahead and start fitting my unit into my hole here. Again, keeping an eye on orientation. I wanna carefully feed my control cord back behind the wall. And then I like to get down low right in front of the panel itself so I can line it up perfectly, make sure it fits in the hole. And then gently, when I'm ready, push it against the wall to ensure full connection between the adhesive, the silicone, and the wall itself. Okay, that looks great. Now at this point, the last step would be to clean up the rest of the silicone that may have squeezed out when I push this against the enclosure wall, and be sure to give it plenty of time to cure before using your shower or your steam shower. Once that's done, that wraps up the installation for the control panel. All right, now that we have all of our connections made, we can reestablish power to our steam generator, turn on our water supply, and then double check to make sure it looks like everything's working correctly. And remember, if you need a little bit of additional help on how to operate your Delta SteamScape Deluxe controls, be sure to check out the separate video we have for that. As always, if you have any additional questions, be sure to reach out to the Delta Faucet customer service team. They're more than happy to help.